Good morning, good afternoon, good evening guys, gals and gentlebods, and welcome back to the shed. Only today we're not in the shed, we're in the workshop again. Today I'm going to be tackling changing the cam belt and water pump on our camper van, the Duchess. This is a 2009 Fiat Ducato base, which is designated X250. Most of the Fiat Ducato range over the years have had an X designation which tells you what model it is. So the early ones from 94 to about 2000, 2001 perhaps, were X230. From 2000, 2001 up to 2006, late 2006, were X244, and from late 2006 onwards up to present day is X250. Now the latest version of this is the facelifted model with different headlights and bonnet arrangement, slightly different style in here. It's often referred to as X290, but it is still an X250, and you can tell what model you've got by looking at the VIN number, the vehicle identification number, which is here on the VIN plate. And it starts with ZFA 250 in this case. That tells me it's an X250. If that said ZFA 244, it would be an X244. If it said ZFA 230, it would be an X230. So that's how you can tell the models apart from the external appearance, but that's the designation of them. So if you've got a Fiat Ducato and somebody asks you what model it is, X230, X244, X250, that's how to establish which one it is. Right, so today I'm going to do the cam belt and water pump on the Duchess. It's 5 years, just over 5 years since I did it last, so it's overdue. Fiat specify 5-year change intervals for cam belt on these engines. In the case of the 2.3, which this engine is, the water pump is driven by the cam belt. If the water pump bearings were to fail, which does happen, then the belt would go slack, the timing would be skipped, the valves would make pistons, and it makes a mess. In actual fact, it rarely destroys the engine in the case of the 2.3, sorry. The valves, although there's 16 valves, twin cam engine, they are vertical. And so if the timing does jump and the valves and pistons meet, it rarely damages the valves or the internals of the engine. What it does is break the steel rockers. The cam followers are roller rockers, so there's a hydraulic tension on one side, hydraulic lift on one side, there's the roller in the middle that runs on the cam, and then there's the other end of it that sits on top and pushes the valve down. And what usually happens, not in every case, but usually if the belt breaks or if the timing jumps, is the ends of the rockers get smashed. So it'll either punch the valve through the end of the rocker or snap the end of the rocker off. So if you ever have the misfortune with a 2.3, it's actually an Iveco engine, not a Fiat engine, but they're a good solid engine. If you ever have the misfortune to suffer a belt break or timing belt skip, it rarely destroys the engine. It's a case of taking the cam box off, stripping all the cam belt drive off obviously, and replacing the 16 rockers, rebuilding the cam box, new belt, new pulley, new tensioners, build it all back up. 99 times out of 100 it's going to be good to go. So there we have it. Right, I've got the kit laid out over here. I'll show you what that is and just talk you through that briefly, and then we'll get started. Right, so here's all the kit. New belt, new tensioner, new idler, new water pump, O-rings for the water pump, and some tools. So this is the timing kit. You've got 4 locking pins there. I'll explain those when we get to it. This is a simple tool I made because the high pressure fuel pump mounts here in that hole, and the pulley on it is clamped onto a tapered shaft with the locking nut. So you need to remove the high pressure fuel pump before you can take the water pump off. And I made this simple tool, which is just a piece of flat bar with 3 holes drilled to match up with 3 tapped holes in the pulley, 3 8mm bolts. So you simply undo the nut, screw that in and tighten those up progressively, evenly, until the pulley pops off the taper. Sometimes you might just need to give it a tap. But that's that. And this is just a blank of plastic that I made up to hold the bolts. So when I unbolt the water pump, I slip each of the bolts into their relative positions. They're actually all the same size with the exception of that one. That's an M6, the others are M8s. They are all the same size bolts, but I like to just pop them all in the various positions as they come out. When I'm taking it apart, I can see that I've got all of the bolts out to hold the water pump on. When I'm putting it back together, I can see at a glance that I've got all of the bolts back in and I haven't missed one. So simple as that. Right, let's get started. Right, so back at the van, first thing I'm going to do is take this front panel off. I'm going to take the headlamp out and I'm going to take this front plastic wing off. That all helps to give better access to the engine to enable us to see what we're doing. You can do it without taking the wing off, but for the sake of the 10 minutes or so it adds to the job, I think it's easier to take that off and give yourself better access. Let's get started. So the front panel is held on with these bolts. They're T30, Torx 30s. I like to use magnetic trays to put the bolts in as I take them out. So there's 4 of those across the top. There's a couple of plastic fasteners in the bottom of the grille. One of these is missing on the Duchess. You just unscrew them. Again, they're T30. And once the centre part is unscrewed far enough, the whole fastener should come out of the grille and separate the grille. So there, that's the plastic fastener. There should be 2 of those. As I say, one of them is missing on the Duchess. But she's an old girl. She's done 213,000 miles, still going strong. Right, so I've got the 4 bolts at the top, got the 2 plastic fasteners at the bottom. That will just lift off now. And now we can get at the fixings for the main front panel, which again are T30s. One brief point worth mentioning, on the earlier X250s like this from 2006 up to about 2015 I think it was, these fasteners have just got a single height step there. All of these are the same design. On later ones, on the facelift models, there are 2 types of these bolts and that step is a different length. So if you're doing a later one, just be sure to keep them separate so that you put them in the right place. The longer stepped ones go in holding that front panel that I've just removed. The shorter ones go in the main front panel behind it. Right, I've raised her up a bit so I can get at the rest of the fixings. There's 2 more in the front, one there, one there. I've taken that one out. That's that one. And then there's 4 more along the underside And now that whole front panel will lift off. Right, so I've got the vehicle jacked up and supported on axle stands. Now ordinarily there's a plastic under tray that goes from the subframe here forward to the bumper support, covers this front side of the engine. The Duchess has long since disappeared, and I've never felt the need to replace it. We just need to turn the steering to full right hand lock to give enough clearance to work in this area, and we need to take out the wheel arch liner as well as this front wing. So I've got the benefit of having a lift to raise the vehicle up. You're probably doing it on axle stands and with a trolley jack. Make sure you put the vehicle on stands. Do not rely on a jack if you're going to work underneath the vehicle. It's far too dangerous. This vehicle weighs 3.5 tons. If that falls on you, you're dead. Game over. And there is no restart like there is in computer games. When you're dead, you're dead. Without further ado, get on and take the wheel arch liner out. Now it's held in by some screws up the front, one in the back corner. There should be one that goes into that under tray, as the under tray is missing on the Duchess, we won't bother. And there's a plastic 10mm nut in the top. Sometimes helps to have a bit of light on what you're working, and I find this head torch to be an absolute godsend. That's got it. That's got him. That's the plastic nut. And now we can wiggle the arch liner out, and as you can see it's a bit grubby in there. Pop that out of the way. Right, so the first things we've got to do is take off this plastic trim and this plastic trim. Right, so take the screw out of the end of that. There's a clip in the middle of that. These are quite difficult to get off the first time. You will need something like that, a plastic trim removal tool. Ease it in under the headlight and prise that out. I guarantee that clip will break every time. The back two will usually come out. Says hopefully, that's it. Pop that somewhere safe. And the top panel, once you've taken the two screws out to the end, there's a plastic plug clip in the middle. Just gently ease that out. And now the headlight is held in with 3 10mm head bolts. 1, 2, 3. Now, if you're putting all of the nuts and bolts into the same magnetic tray, try to have a big tray and separate them so headlight bolts together, grille bolts together, etc. Just makes it a bit easier to remember what goes where when you're putting it back together. There we go. Now there is a spring clip on the back corner of the headlight, so just a firm pull, that will come out. On the earlier X250s like this one, the headlight connection is there, up in the back corner. On later ones it's down at the front corner. It's a simple clip to remove. There's a grey plastic collar and you just slide that out and then the plug can come off. Right, we've got some more T30 fixings there. Hold the top of the wing. 1, 2, 3. And we'll take those out. Now there is one more underneath at the end of the support rail. That's it. They can get quite rusted in down there, especially if, as in the case of the Duchess, that under tray is missing. That's those three. There's another fixing or two up inside the wing, which is a little fiddly to get at. Right, that's the second one out, and now we should be able to lift this wing off, like so. If I just reposition the camera slightly, you can see how much more access there is now with that wing out of the way. We can get in through, there's a nice big hole there we can get in through to get at the parts of the engine we want to work on. Right, now I'm also going to take off the slam panel. You don't absolutely have to, but I find again that it gives much easier access to everything. So there's 3 M6 10mm head bolts at each end, and then 2 M8 13mm head bolts that hold the radiator top supports on. And we also need to take the bonnet catch off the slam panel so that we can get it out of the way. So 3 10mm nuts, 1, 2 and 3. So pull that out, make a mental note of which slot on the cable that is locked into, because that will make the difference when you put it back together of whether it opens the bonnet or not. And now unclip the air intake pipe off the back of the slam panel and just move the radiator mounting brackets out of the way, and you can now lift the slam panel out, slide the bonnet release cable out of the way. So now you can see we've got loads more access to the engine bay. So I've got a 25 litre plastic drum that I've cut the side out of, and I find that makes a great receptacle for the coolant. Now that will take a while to drain, but while that's draining we can take care of some other bits and pieces. One thing I am going to do while that's draining is to remove the lower wing support rail. There we go, that's that one out. Another T30. There's 2 M8 bolts. One there, and one just under here. That's it. And now that rail can be lifted out. There's 2 reasons I take that rail out. One, when you're working under the vehicle, it's very easy to bash your head on the end of that. I've done it a few times and it's painful. And 2, when you're draining the radiator, it has a habit of running onto this rail, running along the end of it and dripping out onto the floor over there where you haven't got a receptacle. So I pop that out the way. Right, so while the radiator's draining, lift the top engine cover off out of the way, we can now take the header tank out. And back up here, header tank here. So there's one M8 bolt there, and there's two cap heads in the back of it that hold the power steering reservoir onto it. They're 5mm socket heads. There we go. That's that one. Then disconnect the hoses. And there's one more hose which is on the bottom of the header tank. Again, one of these funky spring clips. Pop that off. And that hose is coming off reasonably well. That's it. I always take the clip off that one because it's prone to sliding down into the engine bay and getting lost. 3 bolts hold the header tank bracket in. One under there, one inside there. And one nut on a stud. That bracket is now ready to come out. And there it is. What I usually do is tuck that up here and cable tie it to this bracket, or use a metal hook if you've got one. So we get that over the top through there, and I'll just keep that out of the way. And now we can see much clearer what we're at. The only other thing I'm going to take off at this point is the air intake hose that goes from the intercooler up to the throttle body. Now, if it's the first time this engine's had a Cambelt done, this will be a single use clip. You'll have to cut it off and then just put a large Jubilee clip on when you put it back on. And then 2 M8 nuts on studs. Again, because of her age, one of the studs has sheared off in the past. So there's just one holding the Duchess's bracket on. And then we should be able to separate that hose from there, separate him from the intercooler, and then we can take that hose off. Right, so with the back up in the air, I'm going to put a support under the engine. Now I use a scissor jack. You can get support beams that go across the top of the inner wings and support the engine with a chain. Unfortunately, there's nowhere really on the Ducato to put the support beam on. There's no inner wings you can sit it on. So I find it best to support it from underneath. A wooden block to spread the load under the sump. I try to keep it away from this end because there is going to still be some water in the block. When we drop the water pump off, we're going to get water coming out here. So I'm going to put a bucket here to catch that. The reason I use a scissor jack as opposed to a trolley jack or a hydraulic jack is quite simple. The screw, the mechanical screw, can't move. Once it's set at a height, it stays at that height. Hydraulics can leak, and the last thing you want is the engine dropping more than you want it to, because that could put strain on hoses, wiring, exhaust, etc. So I find it much better to use a simple screw jack, scissor jack. I've got a couple of blocks screwed to the base, and I've got a spreader bolted to the top. They take up the worst of the space between the support beam and the sump, and that will support the bottom of the engine. That will support the weight of the engine when I disconnect the top mounting. Right, so now we've got the engine supported, it's time to remove the engine mounting which is here at the back of the engine. They're 18mm hexagon head bolts, 3 of them, and they are pretty tight, so you will need plenty of leverage to break them free. Be careful not to smack your wrench against any parts and damage them. So there's 3 that hold the engine mounting to the back of the engine, and then there's 3 18mm nuts that hold the mounting on to the chassis. With these bolts, they don't tend to rust up, so it's usually a case of once they've been cracked loose, they will usually come out pretty well. So that's those 3 out, and then we can lift the engine mounting out. Right, so with the engine mounting off, the next thing to take off will be the cam belt cover. It's worth noting on the top of the cam box at the far end, above each of the 2 cams, is a little screw plug, socket head cap. The proper way to do this is to remove those, and in the timing toolkit there's 2 pins to lock the cams. The idea is you turn it to the timing position, put the pegs in to lock the cams, put the peg in to lock the crank, and there's another peg to lock the pulley here. So what you should do is put the pins in to lock the cams, put the pin in to lock the crank, slacken the centre nut of the cam pulley so it's free to turn, and put the locking peg in to hold it. And then when you come to put the belt back on, because you've got a bit of free movement on that pulley, it's supposed to make it a bit easier to put the pulley on and more accurate in getting the timing correct. I did it the first time I did one, and I've never bothered putting those pins in since. I just peg the cam pulley, peg the crank, and don't undo the centre nut on the cam pulley, and I've never had a problem with them. They go together perfectly and time up nicely. Right, so while we're at this top end, we'll just undo the bolts that we can get at up here. So there's one there, there's one down the back there. The Duchess is an old girl, she's 12 years old. She was a delivery van before I bought her, and she's done 213,000 miles. She's been around the block a few times, so it's not really surprising that some of the fixings are missing. This is probably the 4th or 5th time this belt has been changed, assuming the maintenance schedules were followed. So bolt there, should be a bolt here, should be a bolt here, and there's one down the front of the timing cover. Now the rest of it pretty much is done from underneath, so we'll run it back up in the air. Right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just lower the engine down a little bit. Don't have to go far. We only really need to go far enough to get at those 4 bolts that hold the pulley on. We don't need to get at all 4 of them at the same time, because we can rotate it. So as long as we can get at one of them, that will do us. Now, the auxiliary belt is on a spring-loaded tensioner. So you need a 15mm spanner. Now ideally a long single spanner. Don't try this at home, children. Definitely a case of do as I say, not as I do. To gain the extra leverage, I'm doing the old mechanics trick of hooking that in there. And then this is where you have to be careful, because if this slips, that spring tensioner will hurt when it bites you. So we get that off. That's it. Get the belt off. And you can take the spanner off, and we're safe again. I haven't managed to get a long enough 15mm spanner to do that in one tool. Right, so now we can take the bottom pulley off. There's 4 bolts, they're 11mm heads. Now with the 19mm on the centre bolt, turn that a bit, and we can now buzz them out with a little impact gun. Put them in the magnetic tray. That's better. Right. So one out. Turned it a quarter turn. Buzz the next one out. Two. And that bottom pulley should now come out. Right. So the next step is to remove the auxiliary belt tensioner, which is just there. That's held on with a 6mm cap head bolt. This is where ball end Allen keys come in really useful. Now on vehicles with aircon, you would have the compressor sitting here, and a part of the bracket overlaps to the timing belt casing. So just unbolt the compressor, disconnect its electrical wiring, tie that up out of the way so it's not hanging on the pipes, and then unbolt the bracket off the block, and then you can get at the fixings on the timing belt cover. There's one more part up there that's got to come off before we get the cover off, and that is the auxiliary belt idler. So I'll do the mechanics old trick. Right, now we can get at these remaining bolts. There's one there. There's one there. There's one a bit further round. That's missing in this case. And there's one just in on the face there, but it's so close to the chassis rail. You really need a small ratchet and short socket to get to it. And that's it. So that's all of the bolts undone. And now the tricky bit of wangling this out. That's it. Just a bit of a fiddle, but it will come out. Right. Now the dog can see the rabbit. So this piece is the bottom of the water pump. The crank locking peg goes in through behind that screw. which is T50. So just crack that, and then you can unscrew it. I tend to leave that on the tool, put it somewhere. Try to make it obvious, because it's very frustrating when you've rebuilt it all and you've got the cam cover back, the cam belt cover back on, and maybe even the engine mounting back on, to turn around and see that, because that means you forgot to put it in, and that means you've got to take it all apart again to put that one plug in. I've done it more than once. Right, so what we need to do now is turn the crank until we can get the locking pin in there, but also we need to make sure that the cam is in its right location. So I might move the torch up to there. Right, so there is the cam locking peg hole, and its equivalent hole in the housing is over here. So we need to turn the engine, turn the crank until that is over here, and at that point we should be able to get the crank locking pin in as well. So these are the two tools. That's the locking pin for the cam, and that is the locking pin for the crank. You can see that slides in and out. So the 19mm socket on the crank, you can turn it over. Right, had a minor disaster and the camera battery ran out, but I turned the engine over, got the cam locking pin in place, and now if I move the torch down to here, swing the camera down to here, you can see where crank locking pin goes in. That's it, that's in all the way now. And then you can screw the outer collar into the housing, and that locks it in place. That can't move anywhere. So the crank is now locked, the cam is now locked. The next step is to undo the high pressure fuel pump, which is there. So that nut is 22mm across the flats. So we crack it loose. There we go. Put those in the magnetic tray. Right, now it's time for the special tool for removing the high pressure fuel pump pulley. Right, so I've got the plate bolted on, got the 3 bolts started, and all I do is with a 13mm spanner just tighten these bolts in progressively and evenly. Do this before you release the belt tensioner, because the tension of the belt will hold the pulley still while you tighten these up. And as you tighten them up, it's just, all it's doing is just putting more and more pressure on that taper that the pulley is fixed on. And there we go. Sorry, I backed the camera. But that's the high pressure fuel pump pulley is now loose. That is the belt tensioner. That's held on with a single 8mm bolt. 13mm across the flats. Undo that, and there goes the tension. And now we should be able to unscrew that. That's the tensioner off and out the way. Nothing particularly wrong with it, but we replace it as routine. So now we can slip the belt off. the high pressure fuel pump pulley off out of the way. Right, so here you can see the top of the coolant pump. So there's 3 8mm bolts, 13mm heads here that hold the high pressure fuel pump on. And this is where my bit of plastic comes in handy. So as I take a bolt out, I simply pop it in its relevant hole until I've got all of the holes filled. Then I know I've got all of the bolts out. And as I said, when I'm putting it back together, once all of the bolts are out of that piece of plastic, I know they're all back in. Now, if you're doing one of these the first time it's been done on an engine, be aware that the bolts that hold the pump to the engine block are Loctited in. So it's best to do it with the engine warm, because if you try to do it when they're cold, you stand a good chance of shearing one or more of the bolts off. I've been there, I've done it. It's a painful and uncomfortable situation to be in. Unbolt the timing belt idler. That's that off out the way. So it's the little ratchet and 10mm socket again to get that one up in the corner. I lied to you a little bit earlier when I said all of the bolts in the water pump are the same. They're not. Focus. The one on the left is one of the bolts that holds the pump to the engine block. The one on the right is one that holds the high pressure fuel pump to the water pump, to the coolant pump. So there's 3 of these and 6 of those plus the 1 6mm. Right, so that's the old pump off and disposed of. The new pump, what I've done is fitted the O-rings, grey one there, black one around there. You get 3 O-rings in the kit. The third one is said to be for the high pressure fuel pump, but I've never found a high pressure fuel pump with an O-ring on it, and I can't for the life of me see a reason for there being an O-ring on it. But all I've done is given it a smear of Vaseline. It just helps to keep the O-rings in place, and it helps to stop the coolant pump sticking to the engine block next time it gets taken off. So then we feed that in from underneath over the high pressure fuel pump, locate that, give it a bit of wiggle, get it in position, and then we can get a bolt in it. Just get one in to start with. Just put the bolts in loose to start with until you've got them all in, and make sure the pump is lined up and fully engaged in its correct position before you tighten any of them up. And when you do tighten them up, try to do it in an even manner. So don't just rope one bolt up, because you stand a chance, if the pump isn't properly aligned, you stand a chance of cracking a piece of the casing off. And it pays to just gradually tighten up the high pressure fuel pump bolts first to seat that fully in its housing. This is where it pays to use hand tools rather than power tools. You've got much more feel with hand tools. I could put the gun on them and buzz them up, but you really do risk the chance of cracking the water pump casing if it goes in on the skew. Right, so once you've got all the bolts in and they're just nipped and you're sure the pump is seated nicely, you can then go around and just nip them up. Make sure they're all tight. There is a specific torque setting for them. I think it's about 25 Newton meters, so it's not huge. And once I've nipped them all, I like to just go around them again and just check that they're all tight. because it would be really bad if one of them came loose when the engine was running and fell out and got into the belt, and it could cause a right mess. Right, so with the pump all bolted up, next piece to go on is the high pressure fuel pump pulley, drive gear, whichever you prefer to call it, and its washer and nut. Just finger tight for the moment, and now we can put the new belt on. As I said in the other video, if there aren't any arrows, I generally fit the belt so that the writing is readable from this side, from the off side. So just feed the belt round those pulleys, starting at the cam pulley. And what I do is I use a couple of these little spring clips, clip the belt to the cam pulley, clip it to the high pressure fuel pump pulley, and then pull the tension on it, and with as much tension as you get on the belt, drop the teeth into the crank gear, and then all I do is just wedge it with a screwdriver on the outside of the belt there, and then you can fit the new tensioner. That's it. Once you get it started, it's easy enough. Just a bit of a fiddle to start with. So just screw the tensioner up by hand. Now you can take the screwdriver out, and in this case you want a 10mm Allen key and your 13mm spanner. So we line the dimple and the notch and nip the tension bolt up. Now we can remove the clips off the belt, tighten the high pressure fuel pump pulley up, we can remove the clips off the belt, take the timing pins out, and now we turn the engine over 2 full turns. We do 2 full turns of the crank so that the cam does 1 full turn and its timing pin should come back to the line, the location that we want it. That's the camshaft locating pin in place. So that screws in, crank's locked, cam peg is in place so the timing is correct. So we're happy with that. Take that off. Extract the crank timing pin, and now is a good time to put that plug back in, lest we forget. Because if we forget to put that plug back in and start the engine, it's going to spew a lot of oil out through the hole into the cam belt. Right, so that's pretty much the nuts and bolts of the job. The rest of it is just a direct reversal of the strip down procedure. I say, putting that plug back in the crank pin locking hole is very important. Without that, it's going to spew oil out. It's going to make all sorts of problems. So it's just a question of putting it all together, putting the coolant in, run the engine up to temperature, make sure if it needs any more coolant topping up, do so, and then you're good to go. Quick road test and everybody's happy. So I'll crack on and get this finished off. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. I'll see you next time. Bye.